The Igbo apprenticeship system is regarded as the largest business incubator in the world, as thousands of business ventures are established each year through this remarkable system. It's been widely studied and recommended for implementation for Pan-African economic development. The vast majority of people within and outside the shores of Nigeria accept this business model as an age-long economic tradition of the indigenous people of South-Eastern Nigeria. This is the part that's known, but there is a part that most people don't know about. How it all began, when it began, and how old this tradition really is. This video will answer these questions, so sit back and let's get right into it. It all began in 1903, but to give some historical context, a few years before that, in 1901, after the successful capture of Aro-Chukwu on Christmas Day 1901, in the expeditions into the hinterland to abolish slavery and slave trade, the colonial government felt bound and confident to make proclamation number 5 of that year, abolishing slave trading and slave keeping, applicable to all the nooks and corners of the protectorate. Then High Commissioner of the Southern Nigeria Protectorate, Aro-Chukwu, declared in a speech, whereas by Section 2 of the Slave Dealing Proclamation 1901, the High Commissioner may at any time, by order published in the Gazette, apply the said proclamation as respect the whole or any of its provisions from a date mentioned in such order to such parts or parts of the Protectorate as in his opinion is or are under the effective control of the government. And whereas all parts of the Protectorate are in my opinion under the effective control of the government. Now therefore, I, Ralph Denham Raymond Moore, Knight Commander of the Most Distinguished Order of the said Michael and the said George, HBM High Commissioner of the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, in exercise of the power in that behalf in the said proclamation contained, do hereby order that the said proclamation as respects the whole of its provisions shall from this first day of January 1902 apply to all parts of the Protectorate. It should be borne in mind that just as the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria was hammering the Igbo, the Ibibio, and the Ogoja people over this matter, Frederick Lugard, who was the High Commissioner of the Northern Nigerian Protectorate, was also hammering the people of the Middle Belt, who had in the past helped to feed the South-Eastern region with slaves. Lugard's words in the North had also resulted in substantially reducing the supply of slaves from that rich traditional source. Sir Moore was convinced that the trading state of the Bight of the Biafra provided the largest market for slaves in the region, and thus, for him, an important issue in the campaign against the slave trade was how to deal with this apparently insatiable demand. It was at this point he decided to propose a new labor regime that would replace the old, which he believed had depended almost entirely on the slave trade and slavery. So, what did he do? One of the approaches he deployed was one that sent a shockwave through the people of the Southern Nigerian, particularly the Eastern region. This shock came in the form of an edict called the Master-Servant Proclamation of 1903. More on that shortly. Now, you should understand that after the colonial powers got a stronger grip of the southeastern region of Nigeria, after Aro-Chukwu in 1901, there was an excess of slaves in the interior that normally would have gone down towards the coastal region to be shipped off overseas. So you could see why Sir Ralph Moore was desperate to do something about the excessive slaves he had on his hands. It was a ticking time bomb, a crisis waiting to explode. He could not risk any mass revolts or political instability of any kind, so it was imperative that he treated the issue as a matter of urgency, and the Master-Servant Proclamation was how he decided to solve it. The Master-Servant Proclamation in 1903 made it possible and legal for the coastal middlemen to go into the interior to recruit young people who were basically former slaves as apprentice traders or for other types of employment. Basically, this proclamation allowed these former slaves to suddenly become apprentices so they could get something doing and not foment trouble for the authorities. It was abolishing slavery without really abolishing it. This proclamation leveraged the Native House Rule Proclamation of 1901. What was that? Very quickly, the Native House Rule Proclamation of the 1901 was a bizarre legal move. It converted slave or families into members of those households and thereby making them some sort of adopted foster children. Sounds complicated. Okay, here is an easy way to understand this. If a family consisted of a father, a mother, 5 children and 2 slaves, after the native house rule proclamation, that family now suddenly consisted of a father, a mother and 7 children. The 2 slaves are absorbed into that family unit and they become adopted children, and their former master becomes their foster father or guardian, whichever the case may be. Crazy as it sounds, that actually happened in 1901 to the shock of the socio-cultural order of Southern Nigeria. But the catch was that even though they were now legal members of households, their status didn't change. They were no longer slaves to the white man, but they were now slaves to their fellow black man, albeit a more dignified slave. If you could say a slave can be dignified. Rather than abolishing slavery, this was actually more of a disguised labor reform to use former slaves of the old trade as a labor force for the new so-called legitimate trade. So, the new guardian of the slave was now allowed by law to give out the adopted child as an apprentice to be recruited by businessmen in the coastal regions who were into trade in oil, palm, rubber, and so forth. Each apprentice was to serve for up to 12 years, and the transaction was to be embodied in formal contracts. The guardian also was compensated for the lost labor, which should tell you all you need to know about this new reform. And so began the apprenticeship system that we know today. Over the decades, this system will become a prevalent practice and it will keep spreading across the entire South-Eastern Nigeria, even after Nigeria declared independence from the British. It became such a part of the South-Eastern Nigeria way of life to the point that even after slavery, people gave their own children to become apprentices, and it kept the system alive. It soon became a tradition for business people from South-East Nigeria to take up an apprentice as they build their enterprise, inculcating entrepreneurship skills into their youth population. With all these taken into account, it is accurate to state that the very first apprentices in South-Eastern Nigeria were originally slaves. Many Igbos may disagree, but this is the dark history of the apprenticeship business model. It should be clear that this model wasn't a product of custom, but a product of circumstance. But it should also be clear that it was no fault of the Igbos. It was a circumstance forced upon them by the British colonial authority. As the decades went by, the apprentices became more prosperous than their educated counterparts. And upon experiencing the rewards from the apprentices, soon, even the biological children of the land gradually began shunning the academic path to undertake the entrepreneurial journey. In conclusion, the proclamation by Sir Ralph Moore was a questionable one because, upon the abolition of slavery, the moral thing to do was to return the slaves to where they were raided or sourced from and reunite them with their families. But the slaves were never returned. Instead, they were converted into forced manual labor for the construction of roads, rails, and overall infrastructural development of southern Nigeria. This proclamation earned backlash for the British monarchy, but the deed was done and the ball was set in motion. There was no going back. It should be known that the Igbos are not the only people who engage in this apprenticeship, but as a reason of their peculiar circumstance with the slave trade, as this video has explained, the resulting apprenticeship system became more pronounced among the Igbos than in any other part of the country. And so it is to this very day. And the Igbos have been able to use this to their utmost advantage, achieving prosperity in trade and commerce anywhere they find themselves. If you found this video thought-provoking, insightful, or enlightening, please give it a thumbs up. Also, click the subscribe button if you want to see more content on African history, politics, and economy that educates and revolutionizes the African mind. Thanks for watching.